It was 1,985, and Brazil still didn't quite grasp what a true shopping center was. But Brazilians knew with absolute certainty where to buy everything they needed, from new clothes for Sunday outings to a speedboat for the weekend. From a color television to a brand new car, there was one place that sold it all. Everything was available at a single address, all under one grand roof, illuminated by spotlights and display windows that seemed like portals to the future. This place had a name every Brazilian family knew by heart: Mesbla. At the peak of its trajectory, Mesbla operated 180 stores spread across major cities and towns nationwide. It employed 28,000 people and offered over 250,000 different types of products. Its employees would proudly say that at Mesbla, only coffins weren't sold. It was so ingrained in the daily lives of Brazilians that shopping there wasn't merely a commercial transaction. It was a weekend activity, a family outing, a ritual of belonging to an idea of modernity that Brazil was still learning to embrace. The display windows overflowed with televisions, refrigerators, imported perfumes, bed and bath sets, cameras, sofa sets, and even automobiles, displayed like works of art on the polished floors of the stores. Mesbla Nautica sold boats. Mesbla Automotiva sold cars. It was an empire within an empire, a city within a city. No other retail company in Brazil had reached so far, so deep into the imagination and hearts of so many consumers. But behind all that grandeur, an invisible fragility was silently growing. And when Brazil began to change, Mesbla failed to change with it. This is the story of how a French company became a symbol of Brazil, how it dominated the retail sector of an entire country for decades, and how, in less than 10 years, everything it had built crumbled irreversibly. It all began not with fanfare or a grand inauguration, but with car parts and the smell of imported grease in Rio de Janeiro in 1912. The French company Établissements Mestre et Blaget opened a small branch in the then federal capital's center, primarily focused on trading automotive machinery, equipment, and accessories. It was a modest operation, little more than a commercial arm of a European multinational, with no grand ambitions beyond serving a restricted clientele of car enthusiasts who were just arriving in Brazil at the turn of the century. But the Brazil of 1912 was changing, and anyone who could perceive this shift could build something much larger than a car parts branch. This is precisely what Luis Lassenha, the French manager of the Rio unit, did. He possessed keen eyes and a rare commercial intuition. In 1924, he convinced his superiors to transform the branch into an independent company. Thus was born the Brazilian public limited company Estabelecimentos Mestre et Blaget, a company with a French soul but an entirely Brazilian vocation. The name was too long for common use, but the solution would come 15 years later, in 1939, when the first syllables of the original corporate name were merged into a new, clean, and strong word: Mesbla. The name was perfect, easy to pronounce, impossible to forget. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Mesbla reinvented itself. Lasagna and his successors realized that Brazil was growing at an accelerated pace. Urbanization was advancing, cities were swelling, and a new middle class was emerging consumerist, eager for modernity, and avid for products that represented progress. In 1952, the company took a step that would change its history forever. It inaugurated its first modern department store in Rio de Janeiro, bringing together in a single, enormous space a variety of products that no other store in the country offered. The idea was simple in theory and revolutionary in practice. Why would consumers need to visit 5 different stores to buy 5 different things if they could find everything in one place? This question, answered in bricks and display windows, fueled an expansion that would take decades to reach its peak, but which from the outset showed signs that something extraordinary was being built. In the 1960s and 1970s, Brazil experienced an economic miracle. The GDP grew at rates of nearly 10% per year. Highways expanded, medium-sized cities gained economic weight, and Mesbla grew along with the country, opening stores in São Paulo, Belo Horizonte, Porto Alegre, Recife, Salvador, and Fortaleza. Each new store was a local event. Mesbla's arrival in a city was like the arrival of modernity itself, announcing that the city had reached a new level. The aisles were wide, with warm-toned carpets and carefully designed lighting. Sections followed one another like chapters in a catalog of desires. First, the perfumery, with its colorful bottles and well-trained sales associates. Then women's fashion, men's suits, and toys that made children stop in the middle of the aisle with wide eyes. Further back were home appliances, electronics, furniture, and in particularly large stores. At the very back, or in dedicated pavilions, the section that became legendary, automobiles and boats. Mesbla was also a pioneer in communication. It was one of the first Brazilian retailers to invest seriously in colorful catalogs sent by mail documents of desire that arrived in family homes and were eagerly flipped through multiple times before any purchase. And it was one of the first to master television, broadcasting prime-time commercials with celebrities like Regina Casé, Andrea Beltrão, and Diogo Villela. Seeing a Mesbla advertisement during the commercial break of the popular TV show Fantástico was as common as breathing. These details transformed a store into an institution, and by the 1980s, Mesbla was precisely that, a national institution. What few realized in that moment of ultimate glory was that the world was about to change in ways Mesbla was unprepared to follow. The 1980s were Mesbla's golden age. Never before had the company been so large, so present, so profitable. Its megastores occupied areas of up to 3,000 square meters in the heart of Brazil's main cities. Checkout lines were long on weekends, parking lots overflowed, and aisles were bustling with families pushing carts filled with products that, for many, represented their first real contact with modern consumption. Shopping at Mesbla was a silent declaration of having arrived in life. The company had become its own ecosystem. In addition to traditional sections, there were entire subsidiaries dedicated to specific segments. Mesbla Nautica sold vessels, and Mesbla Automotiva sold new vehicles of various brands. There were also operations linked to financial services, in an attempt to capture the credit that financed consumer purchases. Gigantism seemed to be the company's greatest proof of strength. No one could compete with something so large, so diversified, so consolidated in the mind of the Brazilian consumer. But gigantism, as history would brutally show, is not synonymous with invincibility. The Brazil of the 1980s was also a country of violent contradictions. While the middle class consumed enthusiastically, inflation systematically eroded salaries and savings. The Cruzado Novo economic plans that succeeded each other like chapters in a tragic series. Calor, Bresser, Verão, Cruzado. Each promised stability, each failed in a different way, and each failure left the country's economic fabric a little more worn, a little less predictable. For a company like Mesbla, which needed to plan inventories months in advance, negotiate with suppliers in an environment of volatile prices, and maintain 28,000 employees on its payroll, hyperinflation was a slow-acting poison. Every month, calculations became more difficult. Prices needed to be remarked almost daily. Contracts with suppliers became a minefield of renegotiations and conflicts. Managing a company of this size, already complex by nature, became, in an inflationary environment, a task that demanded surgical precision and an agility that large structures rarely possess. And at this exact moment, when the company most needed strategic clarity, it committed one of its biggest mistakes. In 1989, with inflation galloping and the fear of a new round of supply shortages on the horizon, Mesbla's managers made a decision that seemed rational at the time but would reveal its destructive face in the following years. They decided to stock up, to stock a lot, to stock everything. They bought merchandise in extraordinary volumes, filling warehouses and aisles with products they expected to sell before inflation rendered them obsolete or devalued. It was a risky bet, made with the logic of those who believe that chaos will never end. But the chaos did end. In July 1994, the Plano Real arrived with a force that all of Brazil felt. Hyperinflation, which had been a perverse companion to the Brazilian economy for decades, was surprisingly quickly brought down. The real replaced the Cruzeiro real. Prices stabilized. The purchasing power of the Brazilian worker dramatically increased. For most Brazilians, it was a historic relief, a liberation that seemed impossible. For Mesbla, it was a shock. The inventories, accumulated with the logic of hyperinflation, immediately lost their meaning. Products that had been bought, anticipating constant price markups, now had to be sold at stable prices, often below their acquisition cost. Cash bled, and while money flowed out, the surrounding market began to transform into something Mesbla no longer recognized. Shopping centers, which were still nascent in Brazil during the 1980s, exploded in number and relevance in the first half of the 1990s. Brazilian consumers discovered a new model of shopping experience. Smaller, more specialized, more agile stores gathered in air-conditioned and secure environments. Casas Bahia aggressively expanded in the popular segment. Lojas Americanas modernized its operations. New specialized chains for electronics, clothing, and sporting goods emerged with a speed that large department stores simply could not match. The generalist store, the model Mesbla had meticulously built over decades, began to appear anachronistic. Consumers, who once needed a single place to buy everything, now had better options for each category. If they wanted sneakers, there was a specialized store for that. If they wanted a television, there was a chain focused on electronics with more competitive prices. If they wanted fashionable clothes, the boutiques in the malls offered something Mesbla could never deliver: specialization, identity, exclusivity. The model that had been the company's greatest strength transformed into its greatest weakness. Internally, problems accumulated with the speed of an avalanche. Mesbla's management structure had grown at the same pace as the company, without ever undergoing a serious streamlining or modernization process. There were 40 executives making decisions that, in more agile companies, would be made by much smaller teams. Meetings multiplied. Processes became increasingly slow, and while the board debated, the market moved forward without waiting. An attempt at diversification in the electronics sector, which included importing low-cost, questionable quality cameras, damaged the company's image precisely in the segment where its credibility most needed to be preserved. Customers bought the products, found defects, couldn't find adequate technical assistance, and didn't return. The trust built over decades began to erode in months. In 1996, Mesbla filed for concordata, a form of bankruptcy protection. It was the first formal acknowledgement that something had gone gravely wrong. Debts already exceeded 1 billion Brazilian reais. The stores, which once overflowed with customers, began to seem too large for the traffic they received. Employees, who had been the company's pride, began to be laid off in successive waves, and the brand, which had been synonymous with modernity and abundance, now carried the silent weight of decay. The worst, however, was yet to come. In 1997, an entrepreneur with a bold reputation and controversial methods entered the scene. Ricardo Mansour, the son of a Lebanese merchant who had built an empire of distressed companies, acquired and restructured with an iron fist, bought Mesbla. He already controlled Mappin, another large Sao Paulo department store. His plan was to merge the two operations and create a Brazilian retail giant capable of competing with any rival. It was an ambitious plan, and like so many ambitious plans that ignore ground reality, it was doomed to disaster. Ricardo Mansour arrived at Mesbla like someone arriving to save a sinking ship, convinced that merely changing the captain would alter the vessel's course. His strategy was clear on paper. Unite Mesbla with Mappin, cut costs, reposition the brand for lower-income consumers, and use the scale of the two combined networks to negotiate better conditions with suppliers. It's the kind of plan that works very well in PowerPoint presentations, and very poorly when it encounters the reality of a company with 1 billion Brazilian reais in debt, deregulated logistics, and an organizational culture that had lost confidence in itself. Mesbla's stores, which once had full aisles and impeccable display windows, began to show physical signs of decline. Some sections lacked products, while others had an excess of unsold merchandise. The disorganized inventory, a legacy of the misguided bets of previous years, still weighed on the balance sheets like a stone tied around the company's neck. The remaining employees, reduced from 28,000 to fewer than 1,000 inches a few years, worked in an environment of constant uncertainty, unsure if they would receive their salaries the following month. The merger with Mappin, which was supposed to be the salvation of both networks, created operational confusion that aggravated problems instead of solving them. Two different corporate cultures, two incompatible management systems, two sets of debts that didn't cancel out but added up. The promised synergy never materialized. What emerged instead was an even heavier, even slower structure, even more incapable of responding to the market with the speed the 1990s demanded. And then, in 1999, the final blow arrived. An investigation by the central bank revealed that Mansour's bank, Cref Sul, had artificially inflated its assets for years. The deficit was over 400 million Brazilian reais. The central bank decreed the liquidation of Cref Sul, and without the financial arm that sustained his group's operations, Mansour lost the credit he had used to keep Mesbla and Mappin minimally functioning. The house of cards collapsed all at once. On the 24th of August 1999, the last Mesbla store closed its doors. There was no ceremony, no speeches. There were only employees carrying boxes, last-minute liquidations to cover at least part of the overdue salaries, and the heavy silence of a place that had been, for decades, one of the busiest in Brazilian retail. Bankruptcy was declared that same year, officially ending a trajectory that had begun 87 years earlier with a small French branch in the heart of Rio de Janeiro. What remained was memory, and memory, in Mesbla's case, was powerful enough to last for decades. Generations of Brazilians who had grown up visiting those immense stores held the name with a mixture of nostalgia and disbelief. How was it possible that something so grand, so present, so seemingly eternal, had simply disappeared? The question hung in the air like dust after a building's collapse. In 2009, there was a timid attempt to revive the brand in the digital environment, but the project amounted to little more than a sketch. It was only in 2022 that Mesbla officially returned to the market, now as a digital marketplace, an e-commerce without physical stores, without impeccably dressed employees, without carpeted aisles or car display windows. The name was alive, but what it represented had completely changed. The digital Mesbla was a shadow of what the physical Mesbla had been, an attempt to extract nostalgic value from a brand that belonged more to collective memory than to the present. And it is precisely there, In this contrast between what was and what remained, that Mesbla's story reveals its deepest lessons. The first concerns the danger of gigantism as a substitute for agility. Mesbla confused size with strength. The more it grew, the more it believed that its sheer volume protected it from competition and market changes. But size without adaptation is not a competitive advantage. It is disguised vulnerability. A company with 180 stores, 40 executives on the board, and 250,000 types of products cannot change direction as quickly as a startup with 20 employees and a single focus. When the market shifted, Mesbla tried to turn and couldn't. Its own feet were too big. The second lesson speaks to the trap of strategic arrogance. For years, Mesbla's leaders saw shopping centers arriving, specialized stores growing, and consumer behavior changing, yet decided that all of this was temporary, that their model had worked for decades and would continue to work, and that Brazilian consumers still needed the store that sold everything. This comfortable and misguided belief prevented difficult decisions from being made in time. Business history is replete with companies that died not from a lack of resources, but from an excess of confidence in the past. The third lesson is perhaps the most universal of all. No company is too big to be swept away by the tide of transformation. Mesbla was Brazilian retail for decades. Its brand was etched into the childhoods of millions of people. Its name was synonymous with modern consumption in a country that was still learning what that meant. And yet it disappeared because the market has no emotional memory. The market responds to the present, not the past. And when the present changes faster than a company can keep up, not even 87 years of history are enough to stop the fall. Mesbla was, in every sense, a mirror of the Brazil it inhabited. It grew in the optimism of the economic miracle, flourished in the consumerist euphoria of the 1980s, stumbled in the instability of hyperinflation, and succumbed to the brutality of accelerated modernization in the 1990s. Its trajectory was not just that of a company, but that of an entire country learning, sometimes in the most painful way possible, that growing is not the same as evolving. The display windows have been dark for over 2 decades. The carpeted aisles have been replaced by other businesses, other names, other promises. But those who lived through the era when Mesbla was the center of the Brazilian commercial universe still hold in some corner of their memory the feeling of entering through those revolving doors and seeing before their eyes everything the world had to offer, gathered in a single place. That no bankruptcy can erase.